Hi. Today we will explain the storyline of the 2014 film Gone Girl. Okay, let's get right to the story. It was Nick and Amy's 5th wedding anniversary. Early in the morning, Nick stopped by the bar he ran with his twin sister, Margot. They chatted for a while as they kept Nick company over drinks. Suddenly, Nick's neighbor, Waltz, called and told him to come home. Unexpectedly, the door to Nick's house was slightly open, and Amy was not inside. Nick found the glass table in his living room shattered. Realizing something was wrong, Nick called out to Amy, who was nowhere to be found. A few hours later, 2 investigative police officers, Rhonda, and her subordinate, Gil, arrived. While walking around Nick's house, Rhonda asked him several questions. Rhonda noticed blood spatters in the kitchen and where Amy had ironed the dress she was going to wear for dinner that night. After officially obtaining evidence of violence in the house, Rhonda asked Nick to come to the police station for further questioning. Nick and Amy were once a harmonious couple. They met at a party in New York and immediately hit it off. When they met, both were writers. Nick worked for a men's magazine, while Amy wrote psychology quizzes for a magazine. Later, it was revealed that she was the inspiration for a children's book series written by Amy's parents, titled The Amazing Amy. The book was a success, but it forced Amy to become a perfect and accomplished child in order to live up to her parents' ideals. After 2 years of dating, Nick proposed to Amy at the launch party for her book collection. For the next 2 years, their married life was fine, full of love and passion. However, their marriage was put to the test in the 3rd year, when a recession hit and they both lost their jobs. They lived off Amy's parents' trust fund, but were forced to cut back to pay off Amy's parents' business debts. Day after day, Nick lazed around, played video games, and adapted to his new daily routine. To make matters worse, Nick received news that his mother, Maureen, was dying of stage 4 cancer. To accompany Maureen in her final days, Nick was asked to move back to his hometown in Missouri. Although reluctant, Amy had no choice but to leave her comfortable life in New York City to live with Nick at Maureen's house. Sometime later, after Maureen passed away, the two of them moved into the spacious house. To support them, Amy withdrew her savings and bought Nick a liquor store for his business. Since then, their married life has changed. In addition to managing a bar that was not very profitable, Nick also taught writing at a college. In addition, Nick began to frequently leave Amy to hang out with his friends. Amy's dissatisfaction with her marriage to Nick culminated in tragedy on their 5th wedding anniversary. At the police station, Nick was asked to give his fingerprints and was questioned about several things that made him feel guilty. From what Amy did every day, who her close friends were, and what Amy's blood type was, Nick couldn't answer with certainty. Nick then informed Amy's parents, Mary Beth and Rand, of the tragedy of Amy's disappearance. That same night, Nick's father, Bill, was caught trying to escape from the nursing home and was also detained at the police station. Rhonda allowed him to leave to take Bill back to the nursing home. While the investigation was ongoing, Nick was asked to stay elsewhere temporarily. Nick agreed to stay at Margot's house. Meanwhile, Rhonda and the team continued to search for evidence at Nick's house. She found a list of unreasonable purchases, but the strongest evidence was an envelope marked Clue 1 found in the wardrobe. After confirming with Nick, Nick said that it was part of a game for his and Amy's wedding anniversary celebration. The next day, Nick and Amy's parents took turns giving press conferences and asking anyone who had seen Amy for information. Various TV stations and newspapers covered the event, making it the most talked about topic. On the same day, Amy's parents showed a photo of Amy with Desi Collins, Amy's ex-boyfriend in high school, whom they suspected because he was very obsessed with their daughter. Moreover, Desi had recently moved to an area close to Amy's residence. After that, he and Rona went to Clue 1's location, which was Nick's office at the university. They found new evidence, namely women's underwear that Nick believed belonged to Amy, and the second clue envelope. After reading the characteristics of the location of the 3rd clue, Nick admitted that he did not know where it was. That night, he drove to Bill's house for a routine check, but instead found the 3rd clue envelope. Unfortunately, Bill's automatic alarm would not turn off, activating a call to the police patrol. Coincidentally, Rhonda was nearby. However, Nick was reluctant to tell the police about the discovery and kept it to himself. On the 2nd day of Amy's disappearance, Nick held a community gathering with volunteers who would search for Amy everywhere around them. The news of Amy's disappearance became so popular that Nick was constantly criticized on the latest news programs. This forced Nick to maintain his composure in public and win the sympathy of the residents so that they would believe that Nick was truly grieving. That same night, Margot confided in Nick that she felt he was hiding something from her. Sure enough, the next morning, Margot caught Nick with his mistress Andy after they had spent the night together on Margot's sofa. Despite her anger at Nick's behavior, Margot remained by his side throughout the investigation. That night, Nick had to give another speech in front of the volunteers. Unexpectedly, one of Amy's neighbors and close friends, Noelle, pressed Nick to reveal where his wife, who was 6 weeks pregnant, was. Everyone was shocked to learn that Amy was pregnant. Nick was especially shocked. He insisted to Rhonda that he had no idea. His frustration peaked after Rhonda cornered Nick with evidence of shopping transactions, credit card debt, and an increase in insurance premiums that he had applied for shortly before Amy disappeared. Nick decided he would not talk anymore without his lawyer. However, he admitted to Margot that he really had no idea Amy was pregnant. Amy herself didn't want to have children. It was Nick who wanted to have children with Amy. In fact, he had his fertility checked at a clinic, showed the results to Amy, and brought home a sample of his sperm. However, Amy threw it away. After Rhonda left, Nick examined the contents of the third clue envelope, which he had not yet been able to decipher. After thinking hard, Nick concluded that the location was in a woodshed. The only shed Nick knew of belonged to Margot. He was right. The shed neatly stored dozens of wedding anniversary gifts for Nick. Meanwhile, Rhonda and Gil searched Bill's house because they were very suspicious that Nick was hiding something there. They searched all the way to the basement and found Amy's half-burned diary. This is where everything almost came to light. Rhonda read half of the book and discovered that Amy was afraid of Nick, whom she believed wanted to kill her. In fact, Amy had even bought a gun to protect herself while she slept. No one knew that Amy was actually fine. On the day she disappeared, she drove far away from Missouri. She had long been planning to frame Nick for murder after discovering his affair with Andy. However, Amy's hatred reached its peak when Nick became a lazy husband. She was determined to teach Nick a valuable lesson. For days, Amy read various crime-themed books and watched police investigation shows. She also deliberately befriended the housewives in her complex and made up stories about her unhappy marriage to gain sympathy after she disappeared. One of the housewives was Noelle, who was pregnant at the time. Amy took her urine sample so that investigators would believe she was pregnant when she disappeared. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Amy began to carry out her plan. She told Nick to go for a walk alone, then threw the stick that would later become evidence into the fireplace. She had planned to end her life to complete the story of Nick's murder. However, after days of following Nick's case, Amy changed her mind. Now she rents a cabin near the harbor, where she lives next door to a young girl named Greta. So that no one will recognize her, Amy changes her beautiful appearance to look completely different. Amy claims her name is Nancy, and that she is running away from her abusive boyfriend. To make matters worse, Amy adds that she saw her boyfriend approaching his mistress with her own eyes. Apparently, Greta felt she shared a similar fate with Amy. They often spent time together while keeping an eye on the latest news about Nick on television. She also didn't forget her next plan, which was to corner Nick and Margot. She reported to the police that there was something suspicious in Margot's lumberyard. Amy claimed she didn't have a penny to her name to Greta. In fact, she carried a wad of cash everywhere in a fanny pack hidden under her clothes. One night, her lie was exposed. She, Greta, and her boyfriend were playing mini golf in the yard. So excited about scoring a goal, Amy forgot to fasten her fanny pack. As a result, the bag fell, and Greta suddenly realized that Amy had been lying to her all along. However, Greta seemed unconcerned about it. It wasn't until the next day that she and her boyfriend threatened Amy to hand over the money. After being physically abused, Amy had no choice but to let them take the bag. Now completely broke, Amy was forced to come up with a plan on the spur of the moment. She called Desi and admitted that she needed help. Desi, who was still obsessed with Amy, automatically came the next day. Desi believed Amy's story that Nick had tried to kill her, forcing her to flee. However, she didn't want to go home while the news was still hot. For that reason, Desi offered protection at her luxurious and highly secure lakeside home. Without hesitation, Amy agreed to the idea. Meanwhile, Margot was shocked to find her warehouse filled with Amy's purchases. She cursed the woman, realizing that she had been tricked all this time. One gift stood out from the rest. Nick and Margot took the gift into the house and opened it. A note from Amy stated that she knew what Nick had been doing behind her back and that she wanted Nick to go to jail. Nick finally understood why Amy had told him to go out alone on their anniversary. To Margot, Nick revealed that he had actually wanted to divorce Amy before all this happened. However, fate had other plans. The next day, Nick bought a plane ticket to meet Tanner Bolt, a well-known lawyer who had supported Nick from the beginning. Tanner laughed at Amy's cleverness and agreed to help him. However, to do so, Nick had to win public sympathy and change their perception of Amy, who had always been seen as the victim. Nick went to meet one of Amy's exes, Tommy O'Hara, who had been imprisoned for allegedly molesting Amy. Disappointed, Tommy said that he hadn't done any of those things but had served 30 years in prison. He sympathized with Nick because they both knew Amy's true nature. After that, Nick tried to approach Desi. Unlike Tommy, Desi was not interested in talking to Nick at all. She greeted him coldly and sent Nick away. The next day, Tanner discussed Andy's involvement with Nick and Margot. Tanner felt that Nick should ask Andy to admit their affair to the public. Of course, Nick and Margot thought that was not a good idea. However, Tanner thought it was a step they should take to show that Nick and Andy regretted their actions and to lure Amy home. 6 days later, Andy appeared on television to read her apology and ask for forgiveness for Amy's tragedy. On the same day, Nick appeared in an exclusive interview on Sharon's special. Tanner had coached him to choose his words carefully so that viewers would believe he was truly sorry. Nick smoothly admitted his stupidity, said how important Amy was to him, and begged Amy to come home immediately. Meanwhile, Amy seemed satisfied watching Nick from Desi's lake house. Jealous, Desi tried to divert Amy's attention. She firmly asked Amy to choose her over Nick, as she was confident she could offer the best. Hearing Desi's firmness, Amy had no choice but to follow Desi's wishes for the time being. Meanwhile, Rhonda and her team went to Margot's house to follow up on the mysterious report regarding Margot's lumberyard. The sudden search caused Nick and Margot to panic, but he tried to remain calm and called Tanner. A few minutes later, Nick, accompanied by Tanner, gave a statement. Rhonda showed evidence from Amy's diary pages and asked Nick to confirm whether what was written was true. Tanner regretted Nick's reckless actions, as he should not have answered immediately, even though he knew what was written was true. However, Nick admitted he had never harmed Amy at all. Their investigation that night led to Nick being taken into custody on suspicion of murder. The police found a wooden stick that was strongly suspected to be the murder weapon. Fortunately, the bail was quickly paid so that Nick could rest at home the next day while the investigation continued. 21 days later, Amy was back to her old self. She was slimmer, and her hair was cut short and neat. She and Desi lived together as husband and wife, as Desi wished. However, Amy was actually very fed up and wanted to leave Desi's house immediately. That morning, after Desi left for work, Amy acted in front of the CCTV camera as if she was being sexually assaulted. For days, Amy solidified her plan until her body was covered in evidence of the assault. On the 29th day, Amy seduced Desi until they slept together. However, while they were in bed, Amy attacked Desi with a knife and killed him. Without washing Desi's blood off at all, Amy drove home to Nick's house. Nick was asleep on the sofa when he suddenly heard the noise of the media waiting in front of the house. He was startled to see Amy come home, injured and looking very shocked. Amy fell into Nick's arms, who was no longer fooled by Amy. However, Nick had to work together to maintain his image in public and act as a husband who was grateful that his wife had returned. He accompanied Amy to the hospital, where Rhonda came to question Amy. Rhonda now felt bad towards Nick because she had previously believed Nick was guilty. The question and answer session between the police team and Amy was brief. Sadly, Amy recounted how Desi had approached her and then kidnapped her. After trying to find inconsistencies in Amy's story, Rhonda still couldn't get any answers. With Amy still in shock and weak, the police chief told her to end the interrogation. After returning from the hospital and being alone with Amy at home, Nick finally urged Amy to tell the truth. Amy knew Nick had installed a listening device. Therefore, she told Nick to take off all his clothes and follow her to the bathroom. While Amy was showering, she confessed to killing Desi and framing her as the kidnapper who wanted to take Amy away so she could return to Nick. She felt it was self-defense because she wanted to stay with Nick. Even though they had heard the confession, Nick and his team couldn't do anything without a direct confession. In fact, Rhonda couldn't help because the public was currently cheering Amy on. On the other hand, Tanner advised Nick to enjoy the spotlight on him from Amy's story. Nick got a book deal, his bar opened a branch, and there would even be a movie inspired by their story. A month later, the media still wouldn't let go of the news about Amy and Nick. Amy continued her role as a wife and role model for many people. She asked Nick to abide by her rules if he didn't want any more drama. That day, they were scheduled to appear on Ellen Abbott's show, the host who had been relentlessly targeting Nick. A few hours before filming, Amy tells Nick that she is pregnant. Nick immediately denies it, claiming he hasn't touched Amy in a long time. He demands a DNA test and a blood test. He even threatens to leave Amy forever. However, Amy had already prepared for this surprise by saving a sample of Nick's sperm. Amy threatened back that she would never leave Nick, even if it meant hurting each other. For her, marriage was painful, so she would do whatever it took to stay with Nick. After learning how far Amy was willing to go, Nick had no choice but to stay.